she'll probably lose the house now," someone whispered just a few feet behind me, their voice soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be heard but loud enough to make sure I did, and I stood there beside my husband's casket with my gloved hands folded neatly in front of me, staring at the polished wood as if it could still reflect the life we had built together, and I didn't turn around, I didn't correct them, I didn't say a word, because in that moment, silence felt more powerful than anything I could have said, and besides, they were wrong, they were all so terribly wrong. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished oak, a scent I had always associated with quiet dignity but now felt heavy, almost suffocating, as people moved around me in slow, careful motions, offering condolences that sounded practiced, rehearsed, like lines from a script they had memorized but never truly felt. "Margaret, I'm so sorry for your loss," they said, their eyes soft with pity, their heads tilted just slightly, as if I might break if they spoke too loudly, and I nodded each time, offering a small, composed smile, the kind I had perfected over decades of hosting dinners and attending charity events, the kind that revealed nothing. My son Daniel stood across the room speaking in low tones with his wife, Rebecca, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression serious but her eyes sharp, observant, calculating in a way she thought no one noticed, but I noticed, I had started noticing a long time ago. Rebecca glanced at me once, quickly, then leaned closer to Daniel, whispering something that made him nod. Not once did he look in my direction afterward, not once did he walk over to stand beside me, to place a hand on my shoulder, to remind me that I wasn't alone, and that, more than anything, told me exactly where I stood in his life now. I adjusted the sleeve of my black dress, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't really exist, just to give my hand something to do, something to hold on to, because grief, I had learned, wasn't always loud. It wasn't always tears and trembling voices, sometimes it was quiet, controlled, sitting just beneath the surface like still water that ran deeper than anyone could see. And as I stood there, listening to the murmurs, the subtle exchanges, the careful glances that slid toward me and then away again, I began to understand something with a clarity that surprised even me. They didn't see me as Richard Whitmore's wife anymore, they saw me as what came after, the widow, the leftover, the woman who had been protected for so long that she must surely have nothing left now that he was gone. "It's going to be too much for her," another voice said somewhere near the back. "That house alone, the taxes, the maintenance. I can't imagine she'll manage." I kept my gaze forward, my expression calm, as if I hadn't heard a thing, but inside, I noted every word, every assumption, every quiet judgment disguised as concern, because these weren't just passing comments, they were glimpses into what they believed, into how they already saw my future unfolding without ever once asking me what I intended to do. A hand touched my arm gently and I turned to see one of Richard's old business associates, Mr. Caldwell, his face lined with genuine sympathy. "Margaret, if there's anything you need," he began, and I gave him a polite nod, thanking him softly, because kindness still existed in small, quiet corners, even here, but it was drowned out by something else, something colder, something that lingered in the spaces between conversations, in the way people lowered their voices when I passed, in the way decisions seemed to be forming without me, and as I stood there, surrounded by people who believed they understood my situation, who thought they could already predict the outcome of my life, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, not relief, not comfort, but clarity, the kind that comes when illusions fall away and the truth reveals itself without apology. They pitied me, they truly did. They looked at me and saw a woman who had just lost everything, a woman who would soon be dependent, displaced, diminished, and I let them believe it. I let every whispered assumption settle into the room without interruption, because there are moments when correcting people only weakens your position, and then there are moments when letting them be wrong becomes the strongest move you can make. And as I placed my hand gently on the edge of Richard's casket one last time, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of joy, not even of comfort, but of quiet certainty, because while they stood there measuring my future in sympathy and speculation, I was the only one in that room who truly understood what had been left behind, and more importantly, what had not been said. I remained by the casket a moment longer after the last group drifted away, listening to the low hum of conversations that no longer bothered to soften themselves when I was within earshot, as if I had already become part of the furniture, something present but no longer relevant. And when the service concluded and people began to file toward the reception hall next door, I followed at a measured pace, my heels quiet against the polished floor, my posture straight, my expression composed. Because dignity, I had learned, was often the only thing no one could take from you without your permission. The reception room was brighter, filled with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation, trays of finger food arranged neatly along long tables, everything done exactly the way Richard would have expected, orderly, tasteful, controlled, and yet the tone beneath it all felt different now, lighter in a way that did not match the occasion, as if for some, the hardest part of the day was already over and what remained was simply logistics. I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted away from grief and toward practical matters. Who would be handling the estate? What would happen to the house? Whether Daniel planned to make any changes? I moved slowly along the edge of the room, acknowledging those who approached me with a nod or a quiet thank you, but I did not linger. I did not invite conversation, because listening revealed far more than speaking ever could. Near the far table, Rebecca stood with two women I recognized from her social circle, her voice low but not low enough. It is just going to be a lot for her to manage, she said, her tone carefully balanced between concern and certainty. That place is nearly 6,000 square feet, and the property taxes alone are more than most people make in a year. One of the women nodded sympathetically, glancing in my direction. Do you think she will sell? She asked, and Rebecca gave a small, thoughtful pause before answering, the kind designed to suggest she was being considerate. I think it would be the practical choice, she said, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not even hurt, but a quiet acknowledgement that what I was hearing was not speculation, it was planning. Daniel joined them a moment later, slipping into the conversation with an ease that told me this topic was not new to him. We will figure it out, he said, his voice steady, confident, as if decisions had already been made behind closed doors. Rebecca placed a hand lightly on his arm again, a gesture that seemed affectionate on the surface but carried a subtle sense of direction, as if she were guiding him rather than supporting him, and I watched the way he leaned slightly toward her, the way his attention followed her lead without question. I turned away before they noticed me, not because I was avoiding the truth, but because I had already seen enough. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, the cool condensation dampening my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. Across the room, a few of Richard's old colleagues stood together, their expressions more reserved, their voices quieter. One of them met my gaze briefly and gave a respectful nod, and I returned it, appreciating the simplicity of that exchange. No assumptions, no hidden calculations, just acknowledgement. I took a slow sip of water and let the conversations continue around me, each word, each glance, each carefully phrased sentence adding another piece to a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. They were not waiting to see what I would do, they were preparing to decide it for me, and yet, the more certain they seemed, the calmer I felt. Because certainty, when it is built on incomplete information, has a way of collapsing under its own weight. I set the empty glass down and adjusted my gloves once more, a small, habitual movement that steadied me, and as I looked around the room at the people who believed they understood my circumstances, who believed they had already accounted for every possibility, I allowed that same quiet, almost imperceptible smile to return, not because anything had become easier, but because everything had become clearer, and clarity, I realized, was far more valuable than sympathy ever could be. I stepped outside for a moment when the room began to feel too small, too filled with voices that no longer tried to hide their assumptions, and the late afternoon air carried a quiet stillness that felt almost foreign after the carefully managed sympathy inside. The sky stretched wide above the parking lot, pale and endless, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to simply stand there, breathing, remembering what it felt like to exist without being observed, without being measured against expectations I had never agreed to. I could still hear fragments of conversation drifting through the open doors behind me, words like downsize and practical floating out as if they belonged to a discussion about furniture rather than a life, my life, and I realized then that this had not started today, it had simply become visible today. The signs had been there in quieter forms, in delayed phone calls, in decisions made without including me, in the way Rebecca had slowly taken control of family gatherings, adjusting traditions with a smile that made it seem harmless, thoughtful even, until one day I noticed that nothing we did felt like mine anymore. That realization settled over me with a calm certainty, not sudden, not sharp, but steady, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to acknowledge it. The door behind me opened and I heard Daniel's voice before I saw him. "Mom, there you are," he said, his tone softer than it had been inside, but still carrying that same distance I could not ignore. I turned to face him, offering a small smile, the kind that revealed nothing. "I just needed some air," I replied, and he nodded, slipping his hands into his coat pockets as he stood beside me, not quite close enough to touch, not quite far enough to seem detached, an awkward middle ground that spoke louder than any words. "You doing okay?" he asked, and for a moment I considered the question, not because I needed to find an answer, but because I wondered what answer he expected. "I am managing," I said finally, and he nodded again, as if that confirmed something for him, as if it fit neatly into the version of events he had already constructed in his mind. He glanced back toward the building, then back at me, hesitating just long enough to suggest there was more he wanted to say. "Rebecca and I were talking," he began, and there it was, the transition from concern to planning, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if I had not been listening for it. "We think it might be a good idea to start looking at some options for you," he continued, his voice careful, measured, something smaller, easier to maintain. I held his gaze, steady and calm, and I could see the expectation there, the assumption that I would agree, or at least that I would not resist, because resistance would require a kind of strength they no longer believed I possessed. I adjusted my glove slowly, deliberately, giving myself a moment before responding. "That is very thoughtful," I said, and the words were true in form if not in meaning. Daniel seemed relieved, his shoulders easing slightly. "We just want what is best for you," he added, and I nodded, because of course that is what everyone says when they are making decisions for someone else. I let a small silence settle between us, just long enough to remind him that not every thought needed to be spoken, not every plan needed to be shared. "I will consider it," I said at last, and that seemed to satisfy him. He gave a brief nod and stepped back toward the door, already turning his attention elsewhere, already moving forward with a conversation that, in his mind, had been settled. I watched him go without calling him back, without adding anything more, because sometimes the most revealing moments are the ones where nothing is said, where people show you exactly who they are without realizing it. And as the door closed behind him, muffling the voices once again, I turned my gaze back to the open sky, feeling that same quiet certainty settle deeper within me. They believed they were guiding the next chapter of my life, shaping it with careful hands and practical decisions. But what they did not understand, what they had not yet realized, was that the story they were writing did not belong to them, and it never had. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the roads were familiar and nearly empty, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement in long golden lines that flickered against the windshield, and I kept my hand steady on the wheel, my posture upright, as if maintaining control of something simple could anchor everything else that had quietly shifted beneath me. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, tall, composed, unchanged, its wide front windows reflecting the fading sky, and for a moment I simply sat there with the engine off, listening to the silence, a silence that no longer felt peaceful but not entirely empty either, just different. I stepped out of the car and walked up the stone path slowly, noticing details I had not paid attention to in years, the way the hedges had grown slightly uneven on one side, the faint creak of the front steps under my weight, the subtle scent of cedar from the porch beams. Richard had insisted on installing himself nearly 20 years ago. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and the house greeted me with a stillness that felt almost expectant, as if it, too, was waiting to see what would happen next. I closed the door behind me and stood in the entryway, my hand resting lightly against the wood for just a second longer than necessary, allowing the quiet to settle around me. The rooms beyond were exactly as we had left them, the living room arranged with the same careful balance Richard had always preferred, the furniture aligned just so, the books on the shelves ordered in a way that made sense only to him, and I walked through the space slowly, not searching for anything, simply observing, remembering. The weight of the day had not disappeared, but it had changed, softened into something more measured, more controlled. I moved into the study, the one room that had always felt entirely his, and paused at the doorway, taking in the familiar sight of his desk, the papers neatly stacked, the pen placed precisely where he would have left it, as if he had simply stepped away for a moment and might return at any time. I crossed the room and ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the desk, not to disturb anything, just to feel the surface, solid and steady beneath my touch, and it was there, in that quiet space, that the memory came back to me with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, a conversation we had shared not long ago, one that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now carried a different weight. "Margaret," he had said, his voice calm, measured, the way it always was when he wanted to make sure I truly listened. "There may come a time when things are not as straightforward as they appear." I had smiled at him then, assuming he was speaking in general terms, the kind of practical wisdom he often shared, but he had held my gaze a moment longer than usual, his expression thoughtful, almost guarded. When that happens, he continued, do not rush to explain yourself, do not try to correct anyone, just watch, listen, and let people show you exactly who they are. I remembered laughing softly, brushing off the seriousness of his tone, but now, standing in his study with the quiet of the house surrounding me, those words settled into place with a precision that left no room for doubt. This was not something he had said casually, this was something he had prepared for. I turned slightly, my eyes moving across the room with new awareness, noticing details that had once felt ordinary but now seemed intentional, the locked drawer he rarely opened in front of others, the files he kept separate from the rest, the way he had gradually taken over certain financial matters without ever excluding me completely, just enough to ensure control remained where he intended it to be. I stepped back from the desk and exhaled. Slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of recognition, the pieces were beginning to align, not all at once, not in a way that revealed everything immediately, but enough to shift the foundation of what I thought. I understood. Outside, the light continued to fade, casting long shadows across the floor, and I moved toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the stillness now feeling less like emptiness and more like space to think, to observe, to decide, because whatever Richard had prepared, whatever he had set in motion before he left, it was not something meant to be revealed in a single moment, it was something meant to unfold. And as I stood there, watching the last of the daylight disappear, I realized that for the first time since the service, I was not thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what I had yet to discover. I remained in the study longer than I intended, letting the quiet settle into something steady and deliberate. Then I moved toward the desk again, this time not as someone remembering but as someone paying attention. I sat down slowly in Richard's chair, noticing how naturally everything seemed to fall into place around me, the height of the desk, the angle of the lamp, the careful organization that once felt like habit now revealing itself as intention. I opened the top drawer first, not because I expected anything significant, but because it was the most ordinary place to begin. Inside were the familiar items, neatly arranged, envelopes, a letter opener, a small leather notebook, all exactly where they had always been, nothing out of place, nothing that demanded attention, and yet I knew better than to expect anything obvious. Richard had never been careless. I closed the drawer and paused, letting my eyes move across the desk again, taking in the details with a different kind of focus. Then I reached for the lower drawer, the one he had always kept locked, the one he rarely opened when anyone else was in the room. I had never questioned it before, not because I did not notice, but because trust had never required explanation between us. Now, that quiet trust shifted into something more active, something that required me to look closer. I pulled gently, confirming what I already knew. It was locked. I leaned back slightly, considering, not frustrated, not impatient, just thoughtful, because if Richard had intended for me to find something, he would not have made it impossible, only delayed. I let my gaze drift again, this time beyond the desk, toward the bookshelf behind it, rows of leather-bound volumes, some rarely touched, others well-worn, and I stood, moving toward them with a calm sense of purpose, my fingers traced along the spines lightly, not searching for a title, but for something that did not quite belong, something that felt just slightly out of place. It did not take long. One book sat a fraction of an inch forward from the rest, subtle enough to escape casual notice, but not subtle enough to be accidental. I pulled it gently, feeling the slight resistance before it came free, and as I did, I heard a faint click behind me, soft but unmistakable. I turned slowly, my attention returning to the desk, where the lower drawer now sat just slightly ajar. I walked back without hesitation, the quiet certainty inside me deepening with each step, and when I pulled the drawer open, I found exactly what I had begun to expect, not chaos, not confusion, but order. Inside were a series of folders, each labeled in Richard's precise handwriting, dates, account names, legal references, everything arranged with the same meticulous care that defined every aspect of his life. I did not rush, I did not pull everything out at once. Instead, I selected the top folder and opened it carefully, my eyes scanning the first page, absorbing the information piece by piece: financial statements, asset summaries, documents that extended far beyond what had ever been discussed openly. And as I turned the page, I felt that quiet clarity sharpen into something more defined, more grounded. This was not a simple estate, not something that could be casually reassigned or managed through assumption. This was something far larger, far more deliberate. I continued reading, each line adding another layer. Another confirmation that what had been presented to the world, to Daniel, to Rebecca, was only a fraction of the full picture. I closed the folder gently after a moment, not because I had seen everything, but because I had seen enough for now, enough to understand that whatever plans had already begun forming in other rooms, in quiet conversations that excluded me, were built on an understanding that was incomplete at best. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the drawer, considering what to do next, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a measured sense of timing, because information, like silence, had its own kind of power when used correctly, and as I carefully returned the folder to its place and closed the drawer once more, I realized that Richard had not simply left things behind. He had left a structure, a system, something designed not just to exist, but to be revealed when the time was right, and for the first time since the day began, I allowed myself to fully accept what that meant. Not everything had been taken from me, not even close. In fact, what remained might be far more than anyone else in that room had imagined, and for now, that was exactly where I intended to let it stay, unseen, unquestioned, and entirely under my control. I did not sleep much that night, not because of grief, but because my mind had shifted into something sharper, more alert, and by the time the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, I was already awake, lying still and staring at the ceiling as if I could see the outline of everything that had quietly changed. The house was silent in that early hour, a kind of silence that felt different from the night before, less heavy, more deliberate, as if it were waiting for direction. I rose slowly, moving through my routine with the same measured precision I had always relied on, making coffee, setting a single cup at the kitchen table, everything familiar and unchanged on the surface, and yet beneath it all, I was no longer moving blindly through habit. I was observing, calculating, allowing each detail to settle into place, the events of the previous day replayed in my mind, not as emotional fragments, but as clear sequences. Rebecca's tone, Daniel's assumptions, the quiet certainty in their plans, and alongside those memories, the documents in the study, the structure Richard had left behind, the pieces that did not fit the version of reality they believed in. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth ground me, because clarity required steadiness, not reaction. By mid-morning, the first message arrived, a brief text from Daniel, asking if I was home, asking if he and Rebecca could stop by later. The wording was polite, careful, but the intention was clear. They were not checking on me. They were moving forward. I read the message once, then set the phone down without responding immediately, allowing the silence to stretch. Not as avoidance, but as control. Timing mattered now more than ever. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, and returned to the study, not out of urgency, but out of purpose. I opened the drawer again, this time selecting a different folder, one labeled in a way that drew my attention more deliberately, legal correspondence, and as I reviewed its contents, the structure became clearer. Not just assets, but conditions, not just ownership, but intention. Richard had not simply organized his affairs. He had designed them, carefully, precisely, with an understanding of how people behave when they believe they are unobserved, when they assume control has already shifted. I closed the folder slowly, absorbing that realization, because it changed everything, not in a dramatic way, but in a foundational one. It meant that what Daniel and Rebecca believed they could manage, what they thought they could direct, was not theirs to decide. Not yet, perhaps not ever. The phone vibrated again, another message. This time more direct, we will come by around noon, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible pause before picking it up. Then I replied simply, that will be fine. No resistance, no questions, nothing that would disrupt their expectations, because expectation, I was beginning to understand, was the most useful thing they had to offer me. I spent the next hour moving through the house, not to prepare for their visit in the way they might expect, but to observe it with new eyes. The living room, the dining area, the quiet spaces that had once belonged to a shared life now becoming something else, something that would soon be tested. I adjusted nothing, changed nothing, because there was no need to alter the setting when the real shift was happening beneath the surface. When noon approached, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the familiar engine, the doors closing, footsteps approaching the front door, and I remained where I was, standing near the window, watching without urgency, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what was happening. I was allowing it to unfold exactly as it was meant to. And when the doorbell rang, clear and steady through the quiet house, I turned and walked toward it with the same composed pace I had maintained all along, not as someone being guided, but as someone who finally understood the direction of the path ahead. I opened the door before they had a chance to ring the bell a second time, and Daniel offered a small, almost relieved smile as if my prompt response confirmed something he had been quietly hoping for. Rebecca stood just behind him, composed as always, her posture straight, her expression carefully arranged into something that suggested concern without ever quite reaching warmth. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping inside as I moved aside. "We did not want to catch you off guard, but we thought it would be best to come by sooner rather than later." I nodded once, closing the door gently behind them. "That makes sense," I replied, my tone even, giving nothing away. Rebecca glanced around the living room briefly, her eyes moving across the furniture, the walls, the space itself in a way that was almost instinctive, as if she were already measuring it against some internal plan. "It is a beautiful home," she said, her voice soft, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested evaluation rather than admiration. I gestured toward the seating area. "Please, sit," and they did, Daniel lowering himself onto the sofa while Rebecca chose the chair across from him, positioning herself in a way that gave her a clear view of both him and me. I remained standing for a moment longer before taking a seat opposite them, maintaining a calm distance, allowing the silence to settle just enough to invite them to speak first. Daniel cleared his throat lightly, a familiar gesture from years past when he was about to say something he had rehearsed. "We have been thinking about what comes next," he began, his words measured, careful, "and we believe it might be time to start making some practical decisions." I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression neutral. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her voice entering the conversation with a smooth confidence that suggested she had already considered every angle. "This house is large," she said, "and managing it alone can become overwhelming, especially with maintenance costs, property taxes, utilities." She paused just long enough to let the list feel complete. "We just want to make sure you are comfortable." I nodded once, acknowledging the surface of what she was saying without engaging with the deeper intention. "Comfort is important," I said quietly, and Daniel seemed encouraged by that, leaning forward slightly. "Exactly," he replied, "and there are some really nice communities nearby, places with support, activities, people your age." I held his gaze for a moment, noticing the way he avoided looking directly at me for too long, as if sustained eye contact might disrupt the version of this conversation he had already constructed. "That is something we can explore," I said, keeping my tone measured, and Rebecca's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly, as if my lack of resistance confirmed that the conversation was moving in the direction she expected. "We can also start looking at the house," she added, her voice careful, "just to understand its current value. The market has been strong, and it might be the right time." There it was, the next step, presented not as a decision, but as a logical progression. I allowed a small pause before responding, not long enough to create tension, but long enough to remind them that I was not simply following along. "There is no need to rush," I said, my voice calm, steady, and for a brief moment, something shifted in the room, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but present. Daniel glanced at Rebecca just for a second, and she adjusted her posture slightly, recalibrating. "Of course," she said smoothly, "we just want to stay ahead of things." I inclined my head slightly, accepting the words without agreeing to the implication, because agreement was not something I was offering, not yet. I let the conversation continue for a few more minutes, listening more than speaking, allowing them to outline possibilities, timelines, ideas that all moved in the same direction, a direction that assumed my role was to accept, to adapt, to follow. And when the conversation finally began to slow, I stood, signaling a natural conclusion without needing to say it directly. "Thank you for coming by," I said, and they rose as well, Daniel offering another small nod, Rebecca a polite smile, and as I walked them to the door, I could feel their quiet confidence, their belief that progress had been made, that the next steps were already beginning to take shape, and I allowed them to leave with that belief intact, because sometimes the most effective way to understand a plan is to let the people behind it think it is already working. After the door closed behind them, the house returned to its quiet, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried weight now, intention, and I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting on the handle, listening to the fading sound of their car as it pulled away. Neither of them had looked back, not once, and that, more than anything they had said, told me exactly how certain they felt about what came next. I walked slowly back into the living room, not to sit, not to rest, but to observe the space they had just occupied, the slight shift of a cushion, the faint imprint of presence left behind, and I realized how easily they had begun to treat this place as transitional, as if it were already preparing to belong to someone else. I moved through the room with deliberate calm, straightening nothing, correcting nothing, because disorder was not the issue, perception was, and this had already begun to drift away from reality. I returned to the study without hesitation, closing the door softly behind me. The quiet here felt different, more focused, more aligned with the clarity that had been building since the previous day. I opened the drawer again, selecting a folder I had not yet examined, one marked with a date only a few months before Richard's passing, and as I opened it, the contents immediately shifted everything from understanding into certainty. The documents were not just records, they were instructions, structured, precise, written in the same careful tone he had always used when he wanted no room for interpretation, legal language outlining conditions tied directly to behavior, to decisions, to actions taken after his passing. I read each line slowly, absorbing the implications without rushing ahead, because this was not something to skim, this was something to understand completely, and as the details settled into place, the full scope revealed itself. Assets distributed not automatically, but conditionally, timelines not fixed, but responsive, control not transferred, but held in place until certain criteria were met, and the most striking part was not the value itself, though the numbers were far beyond what anyone in that room had assumed. It was the structure, the deliberate design that ensured nothing could be taken without consequence. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. Richard had not only anticipated their assumptions, he had accounted for them, built around them, used them as part of the system itself. I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing the realization to settle fully, because this was no longer a question of what might happen, it was a matter of when and how. They believed they were guiding events toward a predictable outcome, but in reality, they were moving through a framework they did not even know existed. Every suggestion, every quiet plan, every decision made without including me was not just being observed, it was being measured against something far more significant than they could see. I stood and moved toward the window, looking out at the driveway now empty, the afternoon light stretching across the pavement just as it had the day before. But nothing felt uncertain anymore, not in the way it had, because uncertainty had been replaced with knowledge, and knowledge, when held quietly, carried its own kind of strength. I did not feel the need to act immediately, to confront, to reveal, because timing was no longer something I needed to chase, it was something I could control. And as I turned back toward the desk, toward the folders neatly arranged within it, I understood that the next steps were not about proving anything to them, not about correcting their assumptions or challenging their plans. It was about allowing those plans to unfold just far enough to reveal exactly what they were willing to do when they believed no one was watching. And for the first time since the conversation in the living room, I allowed that quiet certainty to settle into something deeper, something more defined, because what they saw as progress was, in reality, the beginning of something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, something they would not recognize until it was already too late to change their course. The following days unfolded exactly as I expected, not with dramatic confrontations or sudden changes, but with quiet, deliberate steps that revealed far more than any direct conversation ever could. Daniel began calling more frequently, each conversation framed as concern, each suggestion carefully positioned as helpful, and Rebecca's influence became more visible in the details, the properties she mentioned, the real estate contacts she casually referenced, the way each topic circled back to the same conclusion without ever stating it outright. I listened, I responded when necessary, but I did not commit to anything, not beyond what was required to keep their expectations intact, and that was enough, more than enough, because the more certain they became, the less cautious they were. One afternoon, a week after the service, Daniel arrived alone, his tone more direct than before. I spoke with an agent, he said, standing in the living room as if he already belonged there, just to get an idea of what we are working with. I nodded slightly, allowing the words to settle without reaction. That sounds efficient, I replied, and he took that as encouragement, continuing without hesitation, outlining potential timelines, discussing market conditions, speaking as though decisions were already in motion. I watched him carefully, not as a mother watching her son, but as someone observing a pattern unfolding exactly as designed, because every step he took, every assumption he acted upon, aligned perfectly with the conditions I had read. The structure Richard had left behind was not abstract, it was active, responsive, shaped by behavior, not intention, and that distinction mattered more than anything. Rebecca joined him later that week, bringing documents, printed estimates, information presented Neatly, professionally, her confidence steady, her tone reassuring. "We are just preparing," she said, placing the papers on the table as if they were already relevant, and I allowed myself a small pause before glancing at them, not reading, not engaging, simply acknowledging their presence. "Preparation can be useful," I said, and she smiled, satisfied, because she believed progress was being made, that everything was moving forward as expected, and I let her believe that, because belief, when unchallenged, tends to expand, to grow into certainty, and certainty, when misplaced, has a way of revealing itself in ways no argument ever could. Days passed, then another week, and the conversations continued, more frequent, more confident, decisions discussed more openly, timelines becoming more specific, and through it all, I remained consistent, calm, receptive without agreement, present without surrender. Because there was no need to interrupt what was already unfolding so precisely, I returned to the study often, not to search, but to confirm, to observe how each action aligned with what had been written, and each time, the alignment was exact, undeniable. Richard had not guessed, he had understood, and he had built something that required nothing from me except patience. One evening, as I stood by the window once more, watching the last light fade across the quiet street, I thought back to that moment at the service. The whispered assumptions, the quiet pity, the certainty in voices that believed they already knew how my story would end, and I felt that same stillness settle within me, not empty, not uncertain, but steady, grounded, because nothing they had said then, nothing they believed now, had ever been based on the full truth, and they still did not know it, not yet. I turned away from the window and let the room fall into shadow, my reflection faint against the glass, calm, composed, unchanged on the surface, and I realized that the greatest advantage I had was not the structure Richard had left behind, not even the scale of what remained under my control. It was the fact that they still saw me the same way they had that day, standing beside the casket, quiet, diminished, someone to be guided, someone to be managed, and I had never corrected them, not once, because sometimes the most powerful position you can hold is the one no one else recognizes, and as I moved through the house, turning off the lights one by one, I allowed that quiet certainty to settle fully into place. They believed they were preparing my future, shaping it, directing it, but in reality, they were only revealing theirs, and when the moment came, when everything they assumed collided with everything they never saw coming, I would not need to raise my voice, I would not need to explain anything at all, because the truth, once revealed, would speak for itself, and by then, it would already be too late for them to change what they had chosen to become.